the psalmist said in Psalm 104 verse 24, "O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions." Hello children, today we'll be continuing with the timeline of the development of life. In our last class we spoke about the Proterozoic era, which was the age of early life, and we studied all the simple microorganisms. Today we'll be moving over to the next era on our timeline of the development of life, which is the Paleozoic period. How did the Paleozoic period come about? Now, about 600 million years ago, widespread glaciation brought around the end of the Proterozoic era, and this brought in the age of ancient life, which is the Paleozoic era. Now, this period lasted for 375 million years, and because it's so long, we had to divide it into different periods. So the Paleozoic era has 6 periods. The 6 periods were the Cambrian period, the Ordovician period, the Silurian period, the Devonian period, the Carboniferous period, and the Permian period. So now we'll be studying each of these 6 periods to understand what exactly happened in each of those periods. We are in the Cambrian period. This was the first period of the Paleozoic era. The Cambrian period takes its name from Cambria, which is a Latin name from Wales. Do you know where modern day Wales is? If you don't, well, do your research. But the fossils that were found from the Cambrian period were found in Wales. The climate of the Cambrian period was generally mild. Volcanic activity in various parts of the globe had forced the emergence of large masses of land above seawater. Mountain ranges also were formed in what is now Eastern Canada and New England. However, none of the landshapes of Cambrian times could be recognized as being related to our present-day continents. They differed both in form and geographical position. Throughout the entire period, the seas advanced and receded. By the end of the Cambrian period, almost 1/3 of the entire continent of North America was submerged underwater. So by the end of that Cambrian period, North America today, it was all underwater. The bacteria and algae which had developed in the seas of the Precambrian period continued to exist during the Cambrian. However, life forms were certainly more complex than the microscopic organisms which we studied in the preceding period, which was the Precambrian period. All Cambrian animals were primitive marine invertebrates, and many had developed shells and hard crusty parts and could easily be preserved through the ages as fossils. Sometimes the Cambrian period and the next few periods are actually given the name the Age of Invertebrates due to the great development of animals without backbones. All evidence indicates that life existed only in the seas during that time. Almost 50% of the fossil remains that dates back to the Cambrian period reveal life forms that do not exist today. Over a period of millions of years, new kinds of organisms that lived at the bottom of the sea gradually began to develop. They were the product of simple cell organization and resembled modern algae. A large brown seaweed, for example, could reach a length of 600 feet. Today, this type of algae from the Pacific coast of the United States is commonly called kelp. In the stagnant waters of ponds, bright green algae developed, some with chlorophyll bands spiraling around their bodies. Parasitic microbes, previously classified in the plant division Thallophyta, first developed in the Precambrian period and continued to develop in large numbers in the Cambrian. They are no longer classified as plants but as protoctists. These fungus-like organisms developed in various types, some one-celled and some multicellular. Now, the flagellates were microscopic organisms that varied greatly in size and shape. You remember that in our last class we spoke about the flagellates. Here we have them, so they survived into the Cambrian period and they were varied in size and shape. They all had one or more long hair-like threads called the flagella, which they used like whips to push themselves through the water. So these long hair-like things were what the flagellates used to push themselves through the water. Some modern flagellates, descendants of Cambrian flagellates, produce the phosphorescence that sometimes causes the sea to glow at night. Next, we have the volvox. The volvox looked like a beautiful hollow green sphere that rotated as it swam. It rotated, it looked like a sphere. You can see the volvox. It rotated as it swam. It was really a colony of one-celled green algae all working together. Each little creature waved two tiny hair-like flagella which propelled the jelly-like mass through the water. Volvox contained chlorophyll like a plant but moved about freely and fed like an animal. This tiny creature was once classified as a protozoan, but it is now classified as a protoctist. Among the first microorganisms that lived in the sea was the amoeba. Of course, the amoeba started in the Precambrian seas but survived to the Cambrian period. So, among the first microorganisms that lived in the sea was the amoeba. This one-celled organism consisted of a formless jelly-like mass. It shifted its body to form pseudopods or false feet, as we said in our last class, to move or to surround its food. To reproduce, the amoeba simply divided itself into two. These protoctists have survived to the present day, that is today. Poriferans made their appearance in Cambrian times as sponges made of silica. From Middle Cambrian rocks of British Columbia, geologists have found fossils of what is called Voxia. And Voxia was a glass-like sponge that lived in colonies. It was not a soft-sponged animal because its skeleton was made of silica, a substance contained in sand and used for making glass, so it was quite hard. Animals with bag-like bodies, a mouth at the top surrounded by tentacles, and a hollow stomach were classified in the phylum Coelenterata, a word which means hollow intestine. The name of this phylum has been changed to Cnidaria. Animals in this group are still called coelenterates but are now also referred to as Cnidarians. The word Cnidaria comes from Greek and means stinging. All the animals in this phylum are carnivorous and sting their prey when they come into contact with it. Many kinds of animals in this phylum appeared in the Cambrian period and some even earlier in the Precambrian. By far, the most primitive of the Cnidarians is the modern Hydra, which we also discussed in our Precambrian times. Today's Hydra is almost a perfect replica of its ancestor of billions of years ago. It is shaped like a small tube made up of two layers of cells with a jelly-like substance sandwiched in between. Tentacles which surround the mouth at the top of the Hydra's body are used for grasping food. Now, another member of the Cnidarians is the jellyfish. There we have the jellyfish. Few fossils of the 600-million-year-old animal exist. However, fossilized impressions of ancient specimens have been found where their remains were once washed on shore. The oldest jellyfish fossil was discovered in the Grand Canyon and dates back to the Proterozoic times. Still, another Cnidarian living in these ancient waters was the sea anemone. It had a strong, sturdy, muscular body which culminated in circular rows of tentacles surrounding a mouth. The radial sign of the tentacles allowed the animal to detect its enemies from all sides. The close relatives of the sea anemones are the corals that developed in warm, shallow seas. Stiff cones or horns supported their soft bodies and kept them upright. Corals also use their soft tentacles for capturing food. The streptolasma over here, you see the streptolasma, was one of the earliest wrinkled horn-shaped corals found in abundance in seas at this time. See, shaped like a horn. Can you see it? Bending, just like a horn. The Rhopalonaria over here was a colonial animal that grew into strings of connected short tubes. A tiny animal with tentacles for grasping food lived in each of these tubes. Some colonies look like moss and others look like coral. So these animals were called bryozoans, meaning moss animals or plant-like animals. Although they were once thought to be corals, they are more complex than corals with both muscular and nervous systems and an entire digestive tract. Cambrian bryozoans live together much like their present-day counterparts. The simplest worms began to form a phylum of their own called Platyhelminthes, meaning flatworms. No fossils have ever been found of these worms since they have no hard parts, but scientists assume they lived in Cambrian seas. Flatworms were the first animals to have a definite head with sense organs as well as a nervous system. Flatworms also have survived to the present. Most of them are parasitic and live within the bodies of other animals. I hope you don't have any flatworms inside of you.
No.
The phylum Annelida is a classification that includes only worms with segmented bodies. These soft-bodied creatures did not fossilize Earth easily. Their existence is better known by the burrows or castings left on the ocean floor. These worms ate mud and excreted coiled castings that eventually hardened and formed fossil remains. One particular worm-like creature is the Echinoderms, which was excavated in Canada. This animal had 20 unjointed legs, and each leg possessed a pair of branch-like antennae. It had 2 protrusions on its head there. These are the protrusions on its head, which may have been used to emit a repellent liquid when the animal was frightened. Echinoderms was an important link between the worms and the arthropods because it had characteristics of both phyla. Lamp shells or brachiopods can be traced back to Precambrian times, but they thrived throughout the Paleozoic era. But although they resemble mollusks such as clams and oysters, these brachiopods have their asymmetric valves, which are the shells arranged on top and bottom, while mollusks have their symmetric valves arranged on the left and right. Therefore, a brachiopod can be easily distinguished from a clam. The brachiopod reminds us of an old oil lamp, but the clam has its valves perfectly matched as they join together. Most brachiopods are attached to surfaces and cannot move by themselves. An example of a primitive brachiopod of early Cambrian time is the Cnidarians. And there we have the Cnidarians. Mollusks are soft-bodied invertebrates without segments. Clams and oysters, the best-known mollusks, used a muscular foot to drag themselves along the sea floor. They have no head. Gastropods, another class of mollusks, developed late in the Cambrian period. These snails have a wide muscular foot, a head with eyes, a mouth, and tentacles. The foot spreads out under the shell as it inches along the sea bottom. The shell of the snail is a protective home. A snail can slip its entire body out of the shell and then retreat inside when danger approaches. The shells of the primitive gastropods were uncoiled, such as that of Sinella. So this is Sinella. And Proplina, a snail of the late Cambrian period, had a slightly coiled shell. This is the Proplina. You can see it looks just like a snail. It had head, eyes, feet, and it could hide in its shell. This is the shell when it was frightened. Now the phylum Echinoderms, which means spiny-skinned animals, includes creatures that resembled plants. Like plants, some of these animals had root attachments to anchor them to the bottom of the sea. However, it was their method of feeding and breathing that tells us they were animals rather than plants. The first example of Echinoderms are cystoids. Cystoids were plant-like Echinoderms of the Cambrian period. They had jointed stalks and ovate-shaped bodies. Arms waved back and forth to bring food and water to their ciliated mouths. Cystoids appeared at the very end of the Cambrian period and died out during the Devonian. Eoprinoids resembled sea lilies and were relatives of cystoids. Each had a long stem which culminated in a cup-shaped calyx and 5 brachioles or arms. So this is the long stem, and then these are the 5 arms that they had. Eoquinoids developed at the beginning of the Cambrian period and became very numerous towards the end. The thin red line, this thin red line, it shows the rise and the decline of these beautiful flower-like animals. Some modern echinoderms, such as sea urchins and the sea cucumbers, can be traced back to Cambrian times with almost no changes at all. These are the sea urchin, and the sea cucumber can be traced back to the Cambrian times, and they have no changes. Arthropods represent a large phylum of the invertebrates. Their main characteristic is their jointed feet called pods. No less than 2/3 of all Cambrian life was composed of lobster-like arthropods called trilobites. In fact, the Cambrian period is often called the age of trilobites. Trilobites were creatures with segmented bodies, which means 3 lobes or 3 sections. You might think that this part corresponds to a head, body, and tail, but no, actually, they refer to 3 lengthwise sections divided by grooves. Some trilobites had large eyes with as many as 12 eyes. Others had no heads at all. Some were microscopically small, while others reached the length of 1 foot. Trilobites swam in the ocean waters or crawled on the seafloors. They used their feelers to smell for food buried in the mud. Markings left in the sand suggest that these animals dug up soft-bodied worms to eat. Some may have eaten dead algae that fell to the bottom of the sea. The thin red line of the timeline illustrates the rise of the trilobites. Here, this thin red line, it shows the development and the rise and rise and rise and rise and rise and rise and rise of the trilobites. Their decline and extinction occurred millions of years in the Permian period. So let's trace the rise of the trilobites and see how they rose. They were thriving, 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 thriving. Trilobites, more trilobites, more trilobites, more trilobites, more trilobites, more trilobites, and at the end of the Permian period, they were extinct. Some scientists believe that trilobites may have been related to ancient sea worms. Our first example of a trilobite is the Olenolus. This animal was placed at the beginning of our timeline because it was the first kind of trilobite discovered as a fossil in Cambrian rock. A few fossils of Olenolus have been found in Georgia and Vermont. Now, the Dicollocephalus and the Olinoides serratus were common trilobites in Cambrian seas. Dicollocephalus had a flat, broad-shaped body about 6 inches long. Aglaspis was a trilobite with a head shaped like a horseshoe crab. That's the head shaped like a horseshoe crab. 11 pairs of legs. It had 11 pairs of legs and a long pointed tail. Fossils of this creature have been found in Wisconsin. A member of the largest and most diverse trilobites was the Paradoxides. That's the Paradoxides. It was an arthropod which was 10 inches long. This animal had many thoracic segments and a small pygidium or tail segments. Scientists disagree as to the classification of certain questionable arthropods such as Marella and Sydnea. Some of these animals could have been early crustaceans, but others seem less developed like the trilobites. Marella is sometimes referred to as the lace crab. Here you have the Marella. It's sometimes called the lace crab. And we have the Sydnea. Here is the Sydnea. Some of these animals could have been early crustaceans, but others seem less developed like the trilobite. Marella is sometimes referred to as the lace crab. It had 2 pairs of fuzzy antennae, a narrow thorax, large spines, and legs with gills. Sydnea had a broad body and feather-like antenna, just like feathers. That's the antenna, looking like feathers. Large pincers with joints were found close to the fossilized remains of these animals. If they did, in fact, belong to Cygnea, this would make it a predator. And there we have all the organisms that were found during the Cambrian period. So this is the Cambrian period. We've studied the trilobites, we've seen how they evolved from the Cambrian period and went all the way to the Permian period, and we have some which still exist today, like the sea cucumber, the sea urchins, and some which are completely extinct that we can't find again. Here we can see a snail, which is the Poplina, and we can see that the snails, some of these snails have been in existence for millions and billions of years. So in our next period, we'll be studying the Ordovician period to see what organisms were there.